appointments be. Oh, scatter round my feet may lie.
Janice Selby, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs all the way from British Columbia in Canada. You are a registered professional counsellor specializing in religious trauma syndrome, as well as the founder of the Conference on Religious Trauma and the host of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Today we'll hear all about your journey through your own bouts of religious trauma involving both Pentecostals and Mennonites. But before we jump into your story, let's just find out how you're doing and how the podcast is doing.
Oh, hi, Mark. I'm so glad to be joining you today. I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Syilx people in the Okanagan Valley, British Columbia, Canada. And yeah, things are going great over here. I just had my YouTube page monetized, so my channel. That was really exciting because that's a place where I put all of my video content from Divorcing Religion, which is my podcast, and also from the Conference on Religious Trauma. I share things there a year or so after they happen. So yeah, things are very exciting. We've just chosen the date and got all the speakers in line for Court 2023. Court is a Conference on Religious Trauma. It's going to happen online in October of this year. So tickets are already on sale and it's looking good.
Well, you grew up in British Columbia, the youngest sibling to a very religious family. You were all brought up Pentecostal. So for anyone who doesn't know, what does it mean to be of the Pentecostal faith and what was expected of you?
Sure. Pentecostalism is a branch of Protestant Christianity, very experience and emotion focused. So it was normal in my family for my parents to be speaking in tongues, or if one of us was sick, to be anointed with oil. We would go to church, of course, every Sunday. And I really enjoyed church when I was a child because I loved all the singing. And of course, there was a Sunday school. And then, sometimes through the week, there would be other events going on as well. And this was in the 1970s, so the time of the Jesus people in North America, which basically was a bunch of hippies coming to know the Lord Jesus. And so my parents would always open our home to these folks. And on a Sunday after church, we might have up to 20 people in our kitchen and dining area at home, just getting to know each other. And so it felt kind of fun in that regard. That's what Pentecostalism was like. As I became a teenager, I did get even more seriously involved in the church, for sure. But yeah, growing up as a child, we had rules, things like, I had to wait till I was a certain age to get my ears pierced, but I was allowed eventually to get them pierced. But I couldn't wear hoop earrings. I couldn't wear red nail polish or lipstick or, clothes that were too tight. We had some restrictions on TV programs that we could watch. We did have TV. But yeah, my parents just, they were trying to protect us as parents do. And we attended public school rather than a private school because public schools are much cheaper. So it felt like a strange world to exist in, because I know I wanted to be popular. I wanted to be like the other kids at school. And yet I knew I couldn't swear, and I couldn't maybe go to some of the parties or boy-girl parties or things that were going on like that. And I always had to be very attentive and very caring to all the people going on around me, because that's what Jesus would do. And that was really stressed. So if there was anyone who was lonely, say, or a new student, the teachers would come to me if there was a new student, and they would expect me and ask me to befriend the new student, regardless of what they were like, because they knew I was from a family where we were expected to be kind to everyone. So that's what the the early growing up was like. I will say that my dad is a narcissist and very difficult personality. Growing up in our home was volatile because of him, and there was a lack of safety. It felt unsafe because we never knew what would set him off. And when you have a narcissist parent who's drawn to a fundamentalist religion, then they have all the authority and control. And so I felt safe with rules. I really gravitated towards rules because at home, if I could know the rules, then I could be safe. So that, I think, started me on a very legalistic and authoritarian view of the world. Mm-hmm. One thing I also wanted to mention, just because it's kind of unique, I think, in Canada. So I have two older brothers by birth, and then I have a sister, and my sister is First Nations. You heard me at the start of your show giving our land acknowledgement, because First Nations were here in Canada and North America before anybody else. That's our in America they're called Native Americans. In Canada we call them First Nations, and our government was awful to our First Nations people, and they would go in the 1960s and 70s. They would go onto the reservations where the First Nations people were living, and they would basically steal the children, and then they would remove them and place them in white evangelical or Christian homes, and that's how my sister came to live with us. I remember when I was 4 years old and my mom said, "Oh, you're getting a sister today." And I didn't know any more about it. And then the doorbell rang and there was a very scrawny looking young girl and just looking nervous and clutching a blue suitcase. And I thought, this must be how sisters arrive. And we were told never to ask her about her past because it would be painful for her and we didn't want to cause her pain. And she was expected just to suddenly blend in with our family, even though she had another family and she'd been taken from them. And we were maybe the sixth or seventh home, and she was a young child. And so when she came to us, my parents said, well, she's not going anywhere else. She's been through too much. So she was raised as my sister. And that's part of also being evangelical and being white in Canada. So anyway, I wanted to make sure your viewers had a little understanding about that. So my siblings all walked away from the faith in their teens. I saw how much it hurt my parents, and I vowed that I would not hurt them in that way. And so I started spending more and more time at church. I changed over to a different Pentecostal church to give myself a bit of breathing space from my parents, but I became even more involved. So I was at youth group and choir and drama and prayer meetings. And it was at this point that my identity really began to mesh with my ideology. And I just got more and more fanatical, really.
Some disappointments he, oh, scattered round my feeble life. Sorrow and care my lot may someday share. Still may I say, Lord, here am I.
You got married at age 24 to a Christian man, but somewhere along the way you chose to follow the Mennonite way. Now, the Mennonites are also Christian, but of a very different variety. Janice, why did you decide to go in this direction, and how did life as a Mennonite differ from that of a Pentecostal?
Yes, those are some great questions. I did get married in my early mid-20s to a man that my Pentecostal pastor introduced me to, and he specifically introduced us with the hope that we would end up being a couple and getting married. And this man that I married is a kind person, was a kind person, but we didn't really have anything else in common other than our very strong religious faith. And he wanted to become a teacher, a professor at a Bible college. So we moved to a very small town in a prairie province in Canada, and he was attending Bible college there while I stayed home. We had two young daughters at this time, aged 2 years, and then a newborn as well. And we moved to this tiny town on the prairies, and it was wintertime. It was very cold. I remember that. And it was quite an adjustment for me. And I really missed my mom. I missed my friends. I missed what felt familiar to me. And so I started trying to incorporate myself into the campus life as a student wife. And I would notice when I went to do the shopping at the grocery store, people would come in from the farms all around that town. And I would see these ladies, and they would always be dressed very modestly in dresses, like very modest dresses, and no makeup or jewelry. And they always had their hair up in a bun, and it was covered, always had a head covering on. And I said to my husband, "What's going on there? I didn't know we had Amish folk in Canada." And he said, "No, they're not Amish. They're a type of Mennonite, and they're actually just dressing according to the New Testament." And that was interesting to me. I had read parts of the Bible before, but I think I had glossed over some of that in the New Testament, or just figured it wasn't for us. But when my husband said he didn't see that there was any permission given in the New Testament for women to stop dressing modestly, and I thought that was interesting. So I started reading the Bible and the lexicon and, all these books to explain what I was reading, interpret the Bible. And I saw 2 verses there in the New Testament that said not to be ornate in appearance, not to be wearing gold jewelry and fancy hair, and also for women to cover their hair, because their hair was their glory, you see, and women and men were always to be in an attitude of prayer. And I thought, more rules, how wonderful, how exciting. I didn't know I'd been doing it wrong. And so I asked my husband for permission to become even more devoted to the Bible by changing my appearance, and he gave permission. He wasn't super thrilled about it, but he wasn't against it. So I threw out all my pants and only started wearing long skirts and dresses, got rid of all my jewelry, put away my wedding ring, and started covering my hair. And certainly people on the campus noticed this was a fairly radical change. Nobody asked me about it, and I didn't feel compelled to be insisting that other women do like I did. I felt like it was for me, something personal that I was doing, because I then felt super holy and very righteous, and felt like it brought me even closer to God and Jesus. And wasn't I such a good girl for doing these things? And then I got to know some of these women, these Mennonite women. Mennonites are Anabaptist Christians, so they don't believe in infant baptism. They practice pacifism. They don't vote. They don't fight. They won't go to war. And these ones, the closed Mennonites, what group I was with were the Haldeman, which means Church of God in Christ Mennonite. They really, it was important for them to have a plain appearance and just a simple life of service. And so that is the complete opposite to Pentecostal, which is as showy as it could possibly be. We would go to the Haldeman church, and the men are sitting on one side and the women are sitting on the other. There are not even musical instruments. Whoever is up front, they don't even have a pastor, just different men in the congregation have to take a turn preaching. And someone will have a pitch pipe, and they'll say, turn in the hymnal to this number. And then they just sing. a cappella, but it's not even, there's not a lot of harmonizing going on or things like that, because those things would draw attention to you. And as I got to know these women, so we would show up. I wanted to go, of course, every Sunday because I was really just feeling it, like, oh, this is my tribe, these are my people. And my husband pushed against it. He loved music. We both do, but he loves electric guitar. We're both musicians. And he saw that things were much more confined with this group. And in fact, he said to me one time, "You're making your circle smaller and smaller. How smaller are you willing to make your circle of what's acceptable?" And of course, I just thought he wasn't holy enough, and poor me, I better pray harder, for him to feel the Spirit or whatever it was. But it was so different being with these plain people who were not interested in drawing attention to themselves. And when I started wearing a head covering, I took it very seriously, to be a reminder to myself that I needed to just tamp it down, just stop being so like bubbly and chatty. And I'd always been quite a leader, and I was chastising myself that, okay, I need to step back so my husband can assume his rightful place as the head of our family. He is given to me as my spiritual head. That's what was taught in the Pentecostal churches. He needs to step in and be doing more of the decision making. I need to shut my trap, just start learning to be quiet. And so my head covering to me was an outward reminder of that, because it wasn't something that came easy to me, because that's not my personality. And so I was trying to force myself into this mold that I thought really was what God desired of me and for me and by me. And my husband was, he was uncomfortable with it. And our marriage, I will say, was never an easy marriage, because our personalities are so different. And I was raised in a religious home from birth. He was not. He didn't come to the faith until he was in his late teens. So his personality had already formed. He had an idea of who he was. I didn't. I did not know who I was apart from the Christian belief system. So yeah, things were challenging. The Mennonites never accepted us 100% because we weren't born into it, and we didn't get baptized into it. We'd already been baptized in our Pentecostal churches. So once a year, they would do a very solemn service with foot washing. And we weren't allowed to, we could watch, we weren't allowed to participate. I remember feeling really sad, and that I was trying as hard as I could to conform, because I thought this group was doing it right, and they wouldn't accept me. So that was tricky. And I also, at this time, on the Bible College campus, began homeschooling our oldest daughter, who was 4 by then. And of course, the homeschool community is just ever more insular and isolating. And there was a lot of pride in whose child could memorize the most Bible verses, who was living the holiest life. So yeah, my circle was getting smaller and smaller for sure.
Well, your faith started to crumble during these years when a series of calamities hit the family. So what was this time like for you, and how did you deal with all the doubts that were building up?
Yes, that was truly a painful time. So my husband at the time, he decided that he wasn't going to be able to continue with Bible college all the way to become a professor, and he was going to have to quit for financial reasons and just go into the ministry or become a pastor. And I was mortified, because I did not think he would be a good pastor. He's very cerebral, but he is not much of a shepherd. doesn't have a way with people or emotional understanding. And so I begged him, literally begged him on my knees, please don't do this. I think this is a horrible mistake. But he said, well, God made me the head of this family. I'm the head, and someone has to make a decision. I'm making the decision, and you're coming along. And so that was very hard for me. And we moved to another province, another prairie province, to an even smaller town to take over a dying church. It was down to about maybe 25 members. And this is a small prairie town. It's the people in the church are farmers. They're old farmers. They're basically just looking at this point for someone to bury them. But he had very big ideas about what needed to be done to completely revamp the church and start drawing in young people. So as soon as we got there, out went the hymns and the hymnals, and in came the electric guitars and speaker stacks. And I'm still wearing my modest clothing, my head covering at this point, and just sticking out like a sore thumb here. And my husband asked me at that time, he said, I want you to stop wearing the covering. I think it's creating division between you and the other women in the church and in the town. And I was just heartbroken. That was so sad for me, because I felt I'd been being obedient to God and trying to be subservient to my husband, which didn't come easy to me. But I was going to obey him, so I stopped wearing my head covering, and I really tried very hard to be a good pastor's wife and a good Christian in the community. I became the, like the Kool-Aid mom, or the popsicle mom. So in the summertime, kids whose parents were just kind of kicking them out of the house, not wanting them around there, they knew they could come to our place and they could get a cold drink or something to eat, and they could play with my kids. I tried to fit in to the community, to get us welcomed into the community. It's very hard to do in small towns, because pastors and police just cycle through. They're there for a few years and then they leave. They try and head off to better, greener pastures. So I started writing for the newspaper and helping out at the skating rink. And even I was looking to open a coffee shop. I thought that might be something that would be good for the town. But at the same time, the board was really at their wits' end with my husband, because they had a very different vision of what they wanted to be happening in the church. And so the board members were calling me, and I spent all my time putting out fires emotionally in the congregation. And I would try and explain it to my husband, and he just wouldn't hear it. So it was very difficult already. And then in a span of about a year or 2 years, my parents split up. They'd been married together for about 48 years at that time. So they split up, and my nephew killed someone and went on the run and escaped the police. And the police called me and told me that he might be coming my way, and I had to be prepared to turn him in if that happened. Our youngest daughter was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, and then we went bankrupt, trying to pay for the student loans, and also there were a lot of medical costs involved with the equipment that she needed. So those things all happened within a short span of time. We didn't even have time to catch our breath, and eventually he, came to he just had to leave the church. So we quit. So then we had to move back to a different province, and he was trying to get back to work, and he blamed me for the failure of his ministry dream, because he knew that I hadn't wanted to go there, and he insisted that I just was miserable the whole time we were there, and so nobody would, of course, want to come to the church. So I was trying to cope with him losing his dream, comfort our children as our life was changing so abruptly, concerned about our daughter who could die. And we ended up moving back to my hometown where we met and were married and where my family was, and our old church and our friends. I really needed support. And by that time, I was having suicidal thoughts. And my husband and I were not able to talk about the things that were happening. I felt very betrayed by God, very abandoned by God. Here I had gone out of my way to live as close to Scripture as possible and to be merciful and compassionate and obedient and loving. And just all these terrible calamities were raining down on us. But I didn't feel I could tell my church friends because I didn't want to hear that maybe I had sin in my heart or in my life, or I had done something to offend God, or God was chastening me. That does not hold water when you have a child that you're told now is very sick and potentially could die at any minute. Because I knew that nothing, my child couldn't have done anything, and I couldn't have done anything that would warrant such despicable behavior, capricious behavior from a loving God. So my faith was dissolving. My marriage was hanging on by a thread. And so my husband, at the time, he really needed to feel he had some sense of control or some area of his life where he was succeeding. And for him, that became multiplayer online games, role-playing games. And he really just became enveloped and engrossed in that whole community, so that he would eat his meal and he would disappear into the basement just to play hours and hours of those online games. I think the one that was a real issue and formed between us was called World of Warcraft. And the children were missing their father and asking, where is he? What's he doing? Why is he hiding all the time? And that was just really hard. And for me, I decided, well, God's not where I thought. God's not in Christianity. He maybe is in some other religion, but he's not here. So I gave myself permission for the first time really in my life to start looking in other places. And there was a used bookstore across the street from us. And I remember the kids were in school. By this time, we'd had to put the kids in school. I had taken a job at the hospital because we both needed to be bringing in money. And on this day, I had the day off. The kids were at school. My husband was working back in construction. And so I went to that bookstore across the street. And there was one part of the bookstore I'd never gone in because it was separated by this velvet curtain, and there was a sign, a handwritten sign above it, and it said occult and Eastern religions. And I thought, I've got to go in there. I got to get up my courage and open that curtain and see what's back there. And it was hard for me to do. I took a breath and I did it. I opened the curtain. I went back in there. I closed the curtain so no one would see me. And I just waited for lightning to strike. And it never did, thankfully. And so I was looking around frantically, trying to find a book that could teach me something. And I found one that looked like a textbook, and it compared and contrasted Confucianism and Hinduism and Islam and Christianity, all these different things. So I grabbed the book and I took it to the counter and I asked the clerk for a brown paper bag. I was so nervous. I didn't even want anyone to see me carrying such a potentially heretical book. And she put it in a bag for me, and I ran across the street back to our house, and I put that book in the safest place I could think of, which was my underwear drawer, because I knew even God wouldn't look in my underwear drawer. And so I just left the book there, because it took me weeks to even be okay with the fact that I had brought this book into our house. And then I would just take sneak peeks at it and start reading it. And I started getting more comfortable with expanding my mind, thinking about things that how it works for people in other belief systems. And then I went back to the bookstore and I discovered this author named Louise Hay. And Louise Hay was a very loving person, also I'll say quite flaky, and very into like the whole New Age metaphysical, you can manifest your destiny, and if you're sick, it's because you're harboring whatever thoughts, this sort of thing. But I gave myself permission to start embracing things that had been formerly forbidden, like psychics and astrology and crystals, and maybe there are aliens out there, like just letting myself think about things that I hadn't even been able to think about before. So I wasn't a Christian anymore at this point, but I couldn't say that I wasn't a Christian. There was still a great fear about that, because that could be blaspheming the Holy Spirit. And if I would deny that I was a Christian, then God, if there was still a God, God could deny me. So I just started building this new community of New Age friends, people that believed all these alternate sort of things, and I was enjoying it, and I was loosening up, and my children saw that I was loosening up, and I talked with them at some point. By this time they were getting into their early teens, and I said, Mom's changing a lot, and I know you guys see it. How do you feel about the things that are going on? They're like, you're a lot you're a lot easier this way as a mom than the way you were before. So that was interesting. And my husband and I, he was on his own journey. I was deconverting faster, and it was like holding a beach ball under the water, and that pressure just builds up, and then finally I took my hands off, and the beach ball comes splashing up, and like that was me emerging after all those years of being strangled essentially by my religious beliefs. And it was very messy when I came out of that, and I started drinking. I started smoking marijuana. I ran out and got tattoos. Like, I did all these things that because I didn't want to be associated with that dogmatic thinking that I had been bound by for pretty much my whole life. And as I mentioned, my husband and I are both musicians, my ex-husband. And so we started a band. We started just playing secular music from the 70s and 80s, and going around playing in different pubs and places like that, some private parties. And it was really fun. And it was nice for me not to feel like I had to pretend that I didn't have talent or desires or anything anymore. I was happy to let go of that part of myself that didn't fit, that was just so confining. So those were some of the things that went on for us, but we weren't really talking about our marriage still unraveling, and we weren't talking about the religious faith that was just in the rearview mirror. Eventually, I recognized that the New Age thinking, pardon me, also had a lot of weirdness in it. People started telling me that that they could channel these aliens or these ancient entities or whatever, and I was like, oh really, you're gonna start with this nonsense? I don't want that. I want some evidence for once in my life. And so then at that point I was moving away from the kind of agnostic camp, more into the atheist and completely secular camp. And I realized I didn't need to believe any of the New Age things or Eastern things either. I am still a good person, not holding to any of those beliefs. I can be a secular humanist. I can just love other people for the sake of loving them. I don't have to have an agenda of getting them saved or making them believe the way I believe. I'm allowed to just exist in this world. So my journey really continued that way.
It was around this time that you decided to go back to school to study to be a registered professional counselor. And this was the start of a whole new outlook on life. Isn't that right?
Yes, that is right. So my marriage eventually ended, and I embarked on a new relationship. Uh, and it was a completely different type of relationship that I'd never been in before. And this person didn't have any religious baggage, and they had quite a bit of money, which also was new for me. And they told me I could explore anything, I could be anything, and they would support me. So that was really interesting and fun. And pardon me, I decided I wanted to go back to school to become a counselor. And as I was doing that, I started to recognize my own trauma from my family of origin, growing up with a narcissistic parent and a codependent parent dynamic going on, and how that impacted me. And of course, also the religious trauma then started to surface as I would be talking with classmates or other people about things that to me had just kind of felt like a normal part of my life. And to them, they would say, "Really? Did you really believe that? Like maybe you're making it up. You didn't really believe that." And I really had believed the Bible to be absolutely true and infallible to that point. So I started recognizing some of the things that I was coping with from leaving my own religious ideologies, how they were very much like experience of people who had been in cults and had left cults, and how they were having to kind of reestablish themselves in society and learn things through a completely different paradigm. And that was very uncomfortable for me. That was super eye-opening to think that maybe there was something culty about my religious background. But I thought it was very important. So I started taking notes and just comparing and writing all these things down as I was trying to educate myself. I didn't know anyone else who had been as devout in their religious beliefs and had walked away. So I didn't have anyone that I could talk to about these things. And finally, I was so grateful. On the internet, I came across Dr. Marlene Winnell. And Dr. Winnell is a pioneer in the field of religious trauma. And in fact, she is the one who came up with the phrase religious trauma syndrome. And religious trauma syndrome kind of describes or refers to the symptoms that we have from having spent time in a very high demand authoritarian group, because we have losses as part of that group. We lose our autonomy. And then we lose again. It's a double whammy. When we leave that group, we suffer more losses. So we lose our identity, our community, our worldview. And this is essentially religious trauma syndrome. And it comes with a lot of complex PTSD type symptoms. So I was very excited to read Dr. Winnell's book. I felt like it was my own book. She was describing things that I could absolutely relate to. And I reached out to her and I was able to attend some of her retreats in person in San Francisco. And as I was getting to know her and telling her my story and that I was a counselor, I said, "Do we have any conferences yet on religious trauma?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Well, I think it's time. Let's do some." And so I started working on the first conference on religious trauma, which is also called Court. And I also developed my own divorcing religion workshop. And I started running that online. And people were finding that very helpful. And now I do the conference on religious trauma every year. I'm just getting ready for the next one in October. And last year, I also did a conference called Shameless Sexuality, Life After Purity Culture, because in my one-on-one work with clients, I've found so often that sexuality has really been harmed by purity culture indoctrination, by people growing up in fundamentalist religions that tell them it's not okay to even have sexual thoughts about other people. It's not okay to masturbate. It's not okay to have attractions, to have same-sex attractions. And so something that our sexuality that's so fundamentally a part of us is twisted into something negative and unhealthy, and it just doesn't have to be that way. So that's why I did the Shameless Sexuality conference online last year. And at the conference on religious trauma this year, I'm combining those themes. So we'll have psychologists and social workers and counselors talking about various aspects of religious trauma, and then some that are also addressing purity culture recovery. So I'm really excited about that.
Today, you are in a new marriage and have founded the Conference on Religious Trauma, as well as Shameless Sexuality. As a therapist, you've counseled people who have escaped cults of every variety, from Islam to yoga cults. So what would you say you've learned from these projects and experiences?
I think one thing that's really important, and I also talk about this in the Divorcing Religion workshop, is we have to learn about fundamentalism, because we've been talking about it in terms of religion, but fundamentalist thinking, extremist thinking can happen in any sphere. We see it nowadays in politics as well, but it can happen in the spheres of nutrition, environment. It's easy for humans to get pulled way too far to one side or way too far to the other side and start seeing things in a rigid way, and holding so tightly to our beliefs that in fact it's the beliefs that are holding us, and that's not what we want. We lose our ability to think critically. If we become too attached to an ideology, we want to hold things loosely so that there's room for growth, and give ourselves permission. If new information comes to light, we are going to be able to release those thoughts and beliefs that we had in favor of something that maybe there's greater evidence for, and we see that we were actually incorrect before. I refer a lot of my clients to Dr. Steve Hassan's BITE model, BITE, and that's if we're looking at joining a new group or embracing a new ideology, we want to look at how the members are treated of that group. So is there control around behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions? That's the BITE model, essentially. And we want to be able to steer clear of those things. Is it authoritarian? Is it rigid? Is there basically one person at the top calling all the shots? What's the leader like? Are they narcissistic? And what are they basing their ideology on? Is there actual evidence and proof for it? So these are things that are important for us to consider. Also nowadays, of course, there's so much disinformation out there, and people are so hungry for community. They want certainty, security, order, and acceptance. And religions and cults and conspiracy theory groups, they tie those up in a pretty red bow, so people feel like they're getting all those needs met. And then it's very easy to just kind of ignore the parts that don't feel right, because the rest of it feels so good. So we really need to be teaching our children how to think critically and how to recognize when something doesn't feel right, and that they can talk to us. We want to be teaching them how to research and explore so that they don't fall prey to someone else's faulty ideology.
You're doing amazing work, Janice, and I just want to thank you for everything you're doing to educate the world about high demand groups. I will leave links to your website, social media, and podcast in the description below, and hopefully we can have you back on the show in the very near future.
Thank you. What an honor it's been to share some of my journey with you and all the folks who are watching this. I hope it's been helpful for someone. I want people to know that they're not alone. Sometimes it can feel like an isolating journey when we've walked away from a cherished belief system, but you're not alone. You can reach out. You can reach out to me, and I'll accompany you on that journey. Thanks, everyone.